Tonight we come to what is often called the Radical Reformation, or the left wing of the Reformation, otherwise known as the Anabaptists. We have looked so far at a core of beliefs that were fairly common among the Reformers. We call them the magisterial Reformers: Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Bullinger, Husserl, and many others. Even Huss and Wycliffe, who adhered to the theology of salvation by grace. The Reformers did not envision the kind of response and reaction that they would get from these people known as Anabaptists. And as a matter of fact, they were shocked and startled by their reaction and declared them to be heretics. If we put ourselves in the position of the Anabaptists, we have to say that their thinking was the Reformation didn't go far enough. It needed to continue. And primarily they were concerned about the close relationship between church and state. Now understand that both Luther and Calvin and all the Reformers had separated church and state to a large degree. In other words, they taught that there are certain responsibilities the church has, certain responsibilities the state has. The state has no business running the church has no business running the state. But they did envision a cooperation between church and state. And they did envision a Christian community. But these people felt that, much in line with the United States viewpoint, there should be a total separation of church and state, to where the only Christian community would be a voluntary one that would be formed by congregations. Now, there are a number of different Anabaptist movements. There are a few things they have in common, but they had no creed, no confession that bound them all together, and so there are many differences. We might begin with Thomas Müntzer and the Zwickau prophets. Müntzer had worked with Luther until 1521, and he sympathized with the peasants' revolt. And as we look at these cases, we'll see over and over again that the peasants' revolt seems to have been an event that triggered this response in the minds of many people. That is, a reaction against the civil government. Müntzer, who broke away from Luther, began to teach the doctrine of the inner light. By that I mean he was not teaching that Scripture was the only authority. He was teaching that the authority was a subjective one, a guidance from God that comes directly and personally, apart from Scripture. This idea appeared later in the Quakers established by George Fox. Müntzer and the Zwickau prophets would seize control of the city of Mulhausen, and there they would set up a theocracy, destroying church property and preaching civil turmoil. They were captured, many of them executed, including Müntzer, and the beginning of the Anabaptist movement, with all of this violence, gave the Anabaptists a very bad name. But many of them survived and came together at Schleichheim in 1527 and formed the Schleichheim Confession, which was a sense of union of the Anabaptists, though not really a defined confession of faith. They adopted a statement known as the Brotherly Union. A second manifestation of Anabaptists occurred in Zurich. You remember that there the reformer was Ulrich Zwingli. There were two men who had worked very closely with Zwingli in the early days of his reform movement, Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz. But they disagreed over the idea of a community. If you will recall, in Switzerland, when the matter of reform came up for the church, it was put to the city council, and the city council would vote on it. Now, Manz and Grebel felt the city council should have nothing to do with the Reformation, and there should not be a consulting and a cooperating with the city council. When they began to protest this close relationship of church and state in Zurich, they found an outward sign of their dissatisfaction with community, and that was adult baptism. We mentioned this before. It was introduced for the first time, that is adult-only baptism, and not the baptism of infants, excluding infants. It was introduced at this time, not based upon a biblical argument at all, but based upon a sign of dissatisfaction with the civil government and that close relationship. Now, one was baptized when he was old enough to voluntarily join the congregation. As a matter of fact, they would rebaptize people who had been baptized as babies. Hence, they were given the title Anabaptist, which was kind of a derisive term, which means baptize again, or rebaptizers. Of course, they thought that these people had not been baptized even the first time. Grable himself was a good humanist scholar, a good debater, and a fervent missionary. But he and Montz were arrested for their stirring dissension within Zurich. They escaped from imprisonment, and Grable then later died in 1527, but Montz was recaptured and drowned. The concept was, since Montz has sinned against the water of baptism, water shall take his life. Balthasar Hubmaier, who was a former pupil of John Eck, and always had been an enemy of Luther, and a professor with Eck at Ingolstadt University, took up the Anabaptist cause. Now remember that John Eck was the Roman Catholic, the Dominican, who debated Martin Luther at Leipzig in 1519. Hubmaier became the preacher at Regensburg Cathedral, and then later parish priest at Waldshut. And it was when he was at Waldshut that he became a Protestant. And he first allied with Zwingli, but later became an Anabaptist. He would take up much of the same cause of Grable and Montz, except he introduced foot washing as a religious ritual, as well as, of course, rejecting infant baptism and having an extremely simple Lord's Supper. Zwingli had a very simple Lord's Supper to begin with. It's almost hard for me to imagine a more simple Lord's Supper that the Anabaptists had. Hubmaier was also involved in the Peasants' Revolt and may have been the author of the 12 Articles, because that's a very articulate statement that they wrote to protest the way they'd been treated by their landlords. So possibly he wrote them. And once again, a connection to that Peasants' Revolt. He lived in Moravia for a while, and finally was executed in Vienna in 1528. A third Anabaptist movement are the Hutterites of Moravia, otherwise known as the Moravian Brethren. Moravia, if you would recall, is joined to Bohemia as a part today of the Czech Republic. And Moravia, because of the influence of John Huss, had become Protestant very early. And so many of the Anabaptists that were persecuted elsewhere had fled to Moravia, and they were given asylum there. This particular group was led by Jakob Hutter, who came from the Austrian Tyrol. That's that very beautiful part of Austria in the Alps. And so there they joined with the Bohemian Hussites, who really believed a Reformed theology, the Taborites, and the Bohemian Brethren. They all welcomed them because they were fellow Protestants. They came to believe in the common ownership of property. We might call that communism. That is, all property is owned together. No individual owns property himself. Their Christian community was a tight-knit Christian community of the church. And so everyone in the church surrendered his property to the church, and they held it together. They also believed in pacifism. That is, in not taking up weapons or arms in a war. Luther and Calvin had both believed that there were occasions when there could be a just war, that is, a war where you were fighting for the defense of your country, and this would be permissible. But many of these Anabaptists came to believe, beginning with the Hutterites, that a Christian could not participate in warfare. The Austrian emperor captured Hutter. He was tortured and executed in 1536. Next came Melchior Hoffman, who was a radical and fanatical millenarian. Now, if you're keeping track of the different characteristics of Anabaptists, we're adding another one at this point. Now, all of them managed to believe in adult-only baptism, but not all of them were pacifists, and not all of them were millenarians. But millenarianism became very prominent among the Anabaptists. What do we mean by that? You probably know it best as the premillennial doctrine, the doctrine of the imminent coming of Christ to establish a 1,000-year reign upon the earth. Melchior Hoffman began as a Lutheran lay preacher. That is, he wasn't preaching for a living. He was a leather dresser by profession. He took refuge in Stockholm in 1536 and became obsessed with eschatological ideas. He foretold the imminent coming of Christ, which he said would be on December 31st, 1533. And he said anyone who disagreed with him would be destroyed. And you will see a tendency of these early Anabaptists, at least, to be extremely intolerant and convinced that they alone have the truth. He debated Lutherans over the Lord's Supper, denying the Lutheran doctrine of consubstantiation, and finally joined with the Anabaptists in Strasbourg. He was arrested in Strasbourg, imprisoned, and died in 1543. Earlier, at the Second Diet of Speyer, which was 1529, Anabaptists had been pronounced a heresy, and many of them were blamed for the Peasants' Revolt. We've already seen there's quite a bit of evidence that they seem to have been implicated in the Peasants' Revolt of 1525. So at this time, Anabaptists were indeed persecuted, many executed, many of them were drowned, many of them were burned. The Catholics like to use that technique. Many of them were beheaded. The most bizarre example of Anabaptists is the Kingdom of Munster in 1534. There, a merchant by the name of Bernhard Knipperdoling came to Anabaptist beliefs. He was joined by Jan Matthijs, who had been one of Hoffman's ardent disciples. Matthijs was a baker from Holland, and Matthijs announced in 1533 that he was the prophet Enoch that was promised by Hoffman. He said Hoffman was mistaken about his city, that the new Jerusalem was to be the city of Munster. Munster had already become a Protestant city. It was up near the Dutch border. It was over in Germany, but it was near the border with Holland. And the Anabaptists managed to gain control, thinking again that the Protestants had not taken the Reformation far enough. When they denounced infant baptism, the rumor spread that Munster had already become Anabaptist, and that just attracted many more Anabaptists there. Many followers of Hoffman flocked there. Matthijs died in a brawl and street fighting, but the movement went on. Bernhard Rothman, who was a chaplain, a pastor, and a humanist scholar, was also brought to Anabaptist beliefs and joined with Matthijs. And finally, Jan Buckelson von Leyden, who was an ex-tailor who had the reputation for being a failure at anything and everything he tried, came into Munster after the death of Matthijs and managed to gain control and have himself crowned king of Jerusalem, whereupon a theocracy was set up, and it was considered this was the true city of God. However, both Catholics and Lutherans joined together in subjugating Munster. They took over the city and executed the Anabaptists with every measure of exquisite torture, and Buckelson was also captured, tortured, and killed. It left the image with both Catholics and Protestants that Anabaptists taught chaos in government, in society, in morals, and in religion. In Munster, there were some interesting doctrines that would cause us to think that they were immoral, and that is the practice of polygamy. It seems that there were more women available than men in the city, and so King Jan decided that it would be permissible, and a vision from God had directed him, much in the same way that the Mormons were later directed by Joseph Smith, for men to take a plurality of wives. And so we have the practice of polygamy. Many of the nuns, when they had left their orders, were now willing to marry. And of course, millenarianism was a mainstay, was a primary doctrine of the Kingdom of Munster, along with the idea of communal life, that is, communist society, all property owned in common, no private ownership of property. Obviously, the people at the Kingdom of Munster did not believe in pacifism. And there were other Anabaptists scattered about. Sebastian Frank, who called the Bible a paper pope, and you can see they believe in this inner light. Caspar Schwenkfeld, who denounced Luther as Dr. Softlife. Andreas Karlstadt, who had worked with Luther and was expelled from Wittenberg, now joined with the Anabaptists and denounced Luther. He was a believer in violence. In one sense, it is thought that Jakob Socinus was really an Anabaptist who taught that God has nothing to do with our salvation. It's entirely in our hands. And Michael Servetus, who was executed in Geneva by the city council there, Michael Servetus, who denied the Trinity and hence we have the Unitarian movement really beginning with Michael Servetus. But these people seem to have come to their views through the Anabaptist route. But many were wild-eyed prophets led by an inner light. The belief in millenarianism grew, and always a belief in what they called gathered churches. That is, churches that exist by voluntary membership. Rather than being born into the church, into the community, people would come to a particular church because they chose to come to that particular church. And of course, adult baptism, although not necessarily by immersion. And Anabaptists tended to reject any connection between church and state, with the exception of Munster and of the violence as it erupted here and there. They usually maintained, personally speaking, a rather high standard of morality, and they placed a great emphasis on the Lord's Supper, which they observed not so much sacramentally, but more in the line of zwingli as an act of remembrance. But the more Anabaptists continued, the more they were considered out on the fringes of Christianity, the radicals, as we said, the left wing of the Reformation. And any of the political settlements that came about, such as the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 or the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, none of these covered the Anabaptists and allowed them freedom. As a matter of fact, it was not until Westphalia that the Reformed Church of Calvin gained legal standing. Menno Simons, however, will bring an element of respectability to the Anabaptist movement. And when we think of Anabaptists today, we're most likely to think of Mennonites, because they're the ones who have, more than any other group, survived intact. And much of that is due to Menno Simons personally. Menno Simons was a Catholic priest. He came to Anabaptist views in 1530 when he was in the middle of his life. He was a moderate person, not radical like so many of the Anabaptists. He was well respected by the Catholics, among whom he'd served, and then respected by the Anabaptists. But no one found anything personally to criticize in Menno Simons. And he will denounce the Anabaptist fanaticism and will preach a much more peaceful and conciliatory religion. But he will stress pacifism to the point that pacifism becomes the very centerpiece of Anabaptist theology. And that is why today, in most Anabaptist churches, most Mennonite churches, it is necessary for you to subscribe to the doctrine of pacifism in order to be a member, at least in good standing. Although some of the Mennonites have liberalized some on this, if you listen to some of their scholars, they are still arguing this is the mainstay, this is the linchpin of our theology, is pacifism. And Menno Simons will have much to do with that. He found refuge in Denmark and became the leader of the Anabaptists in the Netherlands and in North Germany. His views were very similar to the Swiss brethren. Once again, he believed in believers' baptism, gathered churches, pacifism, and rejection of participation in civil government. He did not even allow people who served politically to belong to his church. If you were on the city council, you could not belong to his church. So you had to, in your own life, make a separation with participation in civil government. And like all of the Anabaptists, the Mennonites tend not to have a definite creed, a definite confession of faith, which, of course, leaves their beliefs open to revision and change. But without any official doctrine, then every congregation became independent. And if we talk of reaction or subject to change or moving beyond, we can see that with Jacob Amann. Most religious movements will spawn ultra-conservatives or radicals. In one sense, the whole Anabaptist movement had been spawned by the Reformation as a radical expression of the Reformation. But the Mennonites spawned their own radical reaction with Jacob Amann. He was contentious, He was ultra-conservative, and he divided the German-speaking Mennonites. He believed, for instance, that members of his church, who were the true church, of course, should shun all unbelievers, should separate from them, should not live with them, should not live like them. They should be separate. And lapsed members, that is, members of his church who became unfaithful, would be shunned. That is, you would have nothing to do with them. Most of you are familiar with the Amish, and of course the Amish derive from Jacob Amann's group. And you know that they do not live in communities with everyone else. They live in their own communities, often without electricity. They do not own automobiles, and they still drive the horse and buggy. And this is to maintain a clear separation from society. And they became a very close-knit sect. And anyone who disagreed was excommunicated. That's still the way it is today with the Amish people. If you disagree, then you are shunned. You are cut out of the community. So if you're going to remain in the community and remain with your family, you're going to have to conform. The rules are very rigid. Uniformity of dress is imposed. Men wear long beards. They practiced foot washing. And, of course, many of them came from Germany and German-speaking lands, but many migrated to Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania became, and still is, a stronghold of Amish residents. But the Amish have since spread to enclaves all over the country, particularly in the Midwest. Some Anabaptists who did not become Mennonites, who chose not to join the Mennonite movement, joined the Baptist. But I want to stress that the Baptist Church is not an outgrowth of the Anabaptist movement. Sometimes we think that because of the similarity of the names, but actually the Baptist Church has a very different origin that we're going to be talking about. The Anabaptists, however, found one thing in particular they liked with the Baptists, and that is the practice of adult-only baptism, although many of them, I should imagine, would join with the Arminian Baptists. Some of them joined with the Quakers, and some joined with the Independents. And if you look at some of the cardinal principles of Anabaptist belief, there are probably three of them: adult-only baptism, pacifism, and separation from civil government. Now, I just have a guess, a supposition, that when it came down to which one of these groups the Anabaptists would join, because obviously the Anabaptists were not strong enough in England to have their own church, and when it came down to the decision, I would think whichever doctrine became the most important doctrine probably was behind their decision. For instance, if they felt most strongly in adult-only baptism, they would probably join the Baptists. If they felt most strongly in pacifism, they probably would join the Quakers. And if they felt most strongly in the separation of church and state, the total separation, they would join the Independents. But strangely enough, many of their ideas that were considered radical to the main line of the Reformation have been adopted in America. And when they were transported into America, it wasn't so much that the Anabaptists grew, because today the Mennonites are not a particularly large denomination, nor the Amish. But it is the fact that in the climate of American democracy, many American Christians picked up Anabaptist ideas, particularly, you would know, the separation of church and state. This has become almost axiomatic in the minds of people today, the separation of church and state, even though that phrase is not used in the Constitution. But that concept was believed by the Anabaptists. And the idea that an individual is competent to seek salvation for himself, this idea of independence, that really took root in America. And hence there's a shift from Reformed thinking to Arminian thinking in America, much of that having to do with the American concept of independence and self-reliance. You can see that expressed very well at the beginning of the American nation in the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. I remember reading his essays on self-reliance and this idea, I can do it myself. And of course, voluntary church membership, that membership in a church is based on my decision, and I will proceed according to my own wishes as to which church I will join and commit myself to. So the Anabaptists form the radical Reformation, the extreme view of the Reformation, we're going to be looking at some other major groups that will grow up in the Reformation that are perhaps not as radical as the Anabaptists, and then we'll look also at the Catholic response to the Reformation.